Reading in my life is relaxation. You feel better afterwards.
Hello and welcome to Sundoku, the program for Readers Incorporated. I'm Cath.
And I'm Annie Hastwell.
Annie, how are you and what are you reading?
Well, where I've been reading is quite interesting. I've been reading in the middle of absolutely nowhere up in the Kimberley, lying in a tent with a little lamp hanging from the centre of the tent. It was quite wonderful. And I used my iPad so I could see properly as well. I was out there, and because I love to read where I am, something about where I am, I was reading Kings in Grass Castles, which I had never read. Fabulous read, really interesting perspective from the 1950s of the previous 100 years of Australian settlement, written in a sort of certain poetic for its time way. I really love that.
Mary Durack, and you might imagine that the political insight mightn't be what we'd hope for these days, but you were telling me that's not so.
No, I think it's quite refreshing. She's got a very straight look at everything. I thought she might have whitewashed a lot of Australian history that now is emerging about what really happened on the frontiers. But she's pretty straightforward. She just tells it like it is. You get a little confused with all the Bridgets and Marys and Patsies and Patricks and Johns. There's so many Irish families involved in this push westward, northward and then westward. But very, very interesting detailed descriptions of what was actually happening, good and bad. It's fascinating.
The perfect book to have taken with you on that trip.
Absolutely.
Fantastic.
And what about you? What are you reading?
I'm reading an absolute mountain of crime fiction.
Oh, as usual.
A job that I have to do, and I tell you, I'm ready for something else.
You're carrying the show today, so what have you got for us?
Well, a long chat with author Sophie Cunningham about the book of hers that came out a couple of years ago now called This Devastating Fever. Now, that has several references. It's the plague, the pandemic. It's also a reference to the fever in the blood, lust and love, which is a quote from somewhere that comes up in the book. And it's a book about her own effortful writing of this book, which is about Leonard Woolf, husband of the more famous Virginia. Annie, I'm also talking to my good friend Ron Hoenig about his Jewish Men's Book Club. Ron is also the chair of the Australian Council of Christians and Jews, and this is a pivotal moment for them. Sophie Cunningham has written a book on trees, the city of trees. She's written a book for children. For 16 years, she wrestled with writing this book about Leonard Woolf. It's called This Devastating Fever. So 16 years in the cooking. Leonard himself wrote 6 autobiographical memoirs, and there's all that stuff on Virginia Woolf in archives all over the world. So you can see why it was a huge job for her to do. The book is also about her own, or at least the narrator's own, struggles with the writing. And the first question I asked her was whether her narrator Alice in This Devastating Fever is herself Sophie.
I obviously drew on some of my experiences of COVID in a kind of an emotional sense, like what it felt like.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, I kind of traced what it was like to write a novel, but I've ended up talking about this so much that I feel like other things that I was hoping the book was about have got lost.
The title, This Devastating Fever itself, we find as we go through the book is almost hidden in the text. It's a phrase from Leonard Woolf's own writing about the fever in the blood that is lust. So I wondered why that title worked for you to cover all of the different things you're doing in this book.
Well, it felt like a title that weirdly found itself in the future. That's a bizarre thing to say about me. So it was always called This Devastating Fever. And it was originally much more focused on, I suppose, the early relationship of Leonard and Virginia, and therefore the kind of the problems that the sexual dramas they had were particularly pertinent to, the failed honeymoon and failed expectations for marriage. But nonetheless, they go on to have a very solid and very loving marriage despite that. So as the book covered an increasing period of time, like it ended up being more and more decades, I think that focus became slightly less. But then by this point, we're actually when COVID hit, the idea of fever as being creative process, and then indeed being the actual fever of the flu pandemic for them, for us, COVID-19. I just felt like it was a word that had lots of echoes through sort of historical echoes, and just ended up doing a lot of work.
It's a beautiful poetic title for, certainly for COVID, it worked beautifully. And as I say, I've just finished reading it for a second time. Again, it made me laugh a lot. It is a funny book. Alice is a great self-debunker, which is very attractive. And I also got much more of a sense of the architecture of the novel this time, which seems pretty important. So you've got lots of parallels that you're working with. In fact, it's pretty ambitious in that sense. Leonard's and Virginia's courtship and marriage paralleled with Alice's reflections on love and marriage and her marriage to her partner Edith. And then their birth family dramas of Leonard and Virginia alongside Alice's own, and Leonard's desperate attempts to keep Virginia alive are paralleled with Alice's attempts to keep her childhood carer Hen alive in a nursing home. And as you say, the parallels of the plagues of each time. You seem to be interrogating their past and lining up their responses to those sorts of challenges against ours to similar events.
When I first wrote like an early draft of the book, there wasn't the contemporary framing. The contemporary framing, only appeared about 5 years before the novel was finished. And I think that's partly because I was worried that if I tried to write a straight historical novel, or then this could reflect on my own limitations as a writer, but I felt it was a bit stilted, and I was sort of doing more historical recreation, and it felt like the book lacked animation, and that it was going to be more the kind of novel where people read to compare what I'd written versus the real story behind this couple. And that kind of game of gotcha isn't as interesting as some of the things I hoped that I was doing. And so I was trying to work out ways to draw out the ways in which the history is sort of repeating. And I started to get close to the finish line with the novel when I was living in America during the Trump campaign. The way Leonard Woolf wrote about Mussolini and Hitler just had so many parallels with the kind of, I would call it the kind of fascism that's sort of coming back into fashion today, that sort of, I thought, I really need to make more of this. The fact that Leonard Woolf, was very predictive. Like a lot of things he wrote about, a lot of concerns he expressed continue to haunt us. And it's not like he was the only person who was politically astute like that. Many thinkers were. But there's something about him that I thought was really interesting. So I was thinking a lot about that. And then there was a moment in COVID, which I have put in the book, which is something that did literally happen to me, which was walking across the Carlton Gardens and seeing a plane overhead. I hadn't seen a plane for months, and I found myself feeling very emotional. And the fact I was walking across the gardens to go and have my first vaccination also made me feel extremely emotional. And that I suddenly thought, this is what it's like to live in history. And I just had such a strong sense about what it must have been like during wartime, or those kind of periods in which there's years of pressure and every day. In fact, life is totally transformed and will never be the same again. And I suppose this is the first time in my life that that's happened to me. And I think that feeling that gave me an access to kind of some of the things I was trying to do. What is it like to live inside great historical moments? I
found that aspect of the book very moving and very true. As a reader for decades of a lot of writing about and writing by Virginia, I had always steered away a bit from Leonard and felt suspicious of him, I thought, as a good feminist.
Yes.
But you really made me think again. I thought Alice, as the writer about Leonard in the book, had similar reservations about him, but she ended up kind of coming down on his side, and as you say, particularly because he was so prophetic about and his advice, which was ignored, about how to organise retribution against Germany, for instance, after the First World War, and so on.
And also Palestine.
And
it's actually
Palestine.
only a sentence in the book.
Yes,
where he
but
said there's going to be
that
the way
leapt out at me this time, because I thought,
Yes.
well, that's where we're going back to. That's where it's all come from, what's happening today. And his time as a colonial administrator in the early 20th century, in what was then Ceylon, I found him very likeable and sort of just.
And one of the reasons also why I was a bit defensive of him, because obviously he behaved badly in some ways. I mean, all humans do, but it is really hard looking after people with a mental illness. It's really hard keeping people alive who are depressive. Is probably not technically quite the right word for her, but certainly depression and then episodes of mania were characterised some of the worst stages of her fragility or her mental illness. It's a tough gig.
Yeah.
And I thought that just dismissing his slightly oppressive style, and he could be oppressive, as sort of patriarchy, closed down the way we talk about relationships and mental health and what couples have to do for each other to get through. And even though I am a feminist, I just found that those categories become a way of dismissing people and not really allowing you to get to kind of more complex understandings of any number of things. I mean, I felt similarly about the fact that everyone kept calling Virginia a lesbian.
Mm-hmm.
And both in her lifetime, in fact, a bit, and certainly after it, and soon after she died. Since she didn't really have sexual relationships with women either, I wasn't quite sure what that point was either. I mean, obviously she had an intense relationship with Vita Sackville-West, and it was eroticized. I'm not a fool, very obviously. But I think sexuality is more complicated than that.
Yes, I think what you did do, Sophie, poignantly, is just take it all back to her behaviour as an adult woman in her very abstemious, really, sexual life. Goes right back to her abuse at the hands of her half-brother in her childhood, and you make that very poignantly clear.
In early versions, I tried not to write a lot about that because I was worried that was reductive. But the more I read, the more I thought, no, I don't think that is reductive. I think that's a big deal.
And the suicide as well. I mean, there you go. It's a trajectory.
Suicide.
It's not. It's clear and proven, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's an example of where Leonard and everyone else was pretty hopeless. They just thought, oh, boys will be boys, when these teenage half brothers just moved into the house and started giving their sisters started being abusive. And I ended up thinking that did really affect her how she carried herself, her sexual confidence, and how she felt about sex. And she was so anxious about it that anything that got too physically invasive of her body, she would just have a panic attack. So calling her a lesbian just felt like another category that wasn't useful. I do get grumpy about categories, I suppose.
One thing this book isn't is restricting itself to categories. And one of the ways you get past that reductivism or the danger of is by resuscitating Virginia and Leonard as spectres and having them talk to Alice. Now, that was a brave move.
Brave or insane, you be the judge.
Audacious, shall we say.
Look, that really happened in the last draft. Well, that's not quite true. I did had a couple of scenes where Leonard appeared to enter the frame and offer advice, and people read a draft and then they said, too weird, it's not working. So I decided to go harder rather. I thought about it and I thought, it's not working because I haven't sort of made enough of it. So I went harder. And once I gave myself permission to just let those voices come to life, almost as contemporary figures talking to the contemporary writer,
I liked it a lot because it gave the characters a chance to reconsider their own lives.
That's right, and they stop just being passive
Yes.
objects of history or something, don't
Yes, and pass judgment on how they behaved, often
Yeah.
adverse judgment.
I really didn't want Virginia to be a victim.
No.
And I think I used to do this myself too. When people have had tragic deaths, as she did, you tend to get very fixated on that. But goodness me, she had an extraordinary life, a very rich life. And the fact that she did, end up committing suicide doesn't mean that she hadn't had a really full life, an important life. And so I thought sort of having her continuing to be a very present voice was one way of giving her, I don't know, a bit more respect.
One of the things that you make clear through Alice in her struggles in real life with the book is the hard labour of research and the absolute libraries full of material about both of them that she had to consume and then regurgitate and consume a few times, really, go over and over them, go to different places in the world where the collections are held and think about them again, come back, find out that Victoria Glendinning's been there working on her biography of Leonard Woolf. I'm sure that was true.
It's just despondent, as you can imagine, when I saw her name in the guest book of the library. It's like, oh, God.
I bet. So, in fact, only a very small amount of that material makes its way into the book. You had to decide what were the things that resonated the most that you wanted to use. And
I think the years it took to write it helped me do that in a way. I stopped trying so hard to cover all the bases. I could write them more as friends I knew a lot about.
Yes. For a writer, I reckon this is an agonising book to read because it brings up the question, why bother all the time? And
sure does. And I'm still sitting down to write another novel, and I get about an hour done a day if I'm lucky, and then I think, why bother?
I feel you there, and I think Alice and Leonard have a little bit of a chat about that at one point, and Leonard says something like, well, the books themselves don't matter, but reading books helps. What does he say? Helps us stay on track or stay interested in life?
He said, a lot of people have quoted that back to me, and it's a line. It's a good line, but it's a fictional line, so it's not like it's something he really said. But that in reading and writers' lives, it can just all seem to be not a big deal, but it can somehow, for the reader, can just be transformative or somehow change, kind of sustain them in a way that you wouldn't always appreciate when you're just kind of bumbling around in the dark.
And I guess that's true because, Leonard, from his perspective as long dead, can say, look, nothing matters. Nothing matters. and yet, go ahead, keep reading books.
That is the question. If you think nothing matters and you don't believe in God, you still have to create meaning, because we have to create meaning to be alive or to have meaningful lives. So how do you create meaning and connect to the joys and beauties of life? That's certainly something Virginia thought a lot about in her writing. Leonard was more a doer, I think, in that sense. You do have to kind of create meaning out of your life. And also, I also suspect, some of my interests changed over the years of writing it. I became a childless woman over the course of writing the book, as in it got to the point when clearly I was not going to have kids, which I suppose when I first started it, possibly that might have been on the cards for me. And so I do think you can't sort of give that job to your children. Children can create meaning, and the right raising of good humans is an incredible task. And if that's not going to be the way you're going to be able to somehow kind of create meaning in the world, there's books and ideas and gardens and cooking and loving people, and you sort of have to be a bit more conscious, I think, about how you do it.
Sophie, it's just been a delight to talk with you, and I absolutely love the book again. So, congrats, and thank you for talking to me.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
That was Sophie Cunningham, author of This Devastating Fever. It's got imperialism, colonialism, plague, the job of writing, coercive control or tough love, the saga of Leonard and Virginia. It's got everything.
Can't wait to get my hands on it.
let's move on to a chat with Ron Hoenig. Ron is the chair of the Australian Council of Christians and Jews. He's an actor of some repute. He's a teacher and a journalist. And he is also the founder of a Jewish men's book club. So I had a chat to Ron about his reading history, about what they do in the book club and what they're reading now.
One of the things that we established at the synagogue is a Jewish men's book group. The women all have a book group and they meet every month and they're quite religious about it and they give marks to the books. And I just thought, with this small group of people who are interested in reading books, Jewish men, of course then we have to worry about what's a Jewish book. And so we've been reading a diversity of books, a large text called Anti-Judaism, which traces the Judeophobic messages in a lot of Enlightenment and way back. So it traces it through to Shakespeare and Dickens and all that. And we've read genealogy books, people discovering that they're Jewish or their partner's Jewish or whatever. And with the current situation, we're reading a very interesting book by Rabbi Jonathan Sacks about religious violence. And of course he's not in favour of religious violence. And we read this enormous book called The Book of Jacob. It's like 1,000 pages by a non-Jewish Ukrainian, not sure, author about one of the people who was a Jewish messiah in the 17th century. So we get together, we provide each other food, and then we talk about the book, and really it's a way of bringing us together to talk about stuff. And of course the stuff is often to do with what does Judaism mean to you? Almost none of us are actually believers. That's not what Judaism's about. So when we talk about Judaism, it's really a kind of ethnicity, but more than that, like a culture.
Yeah.
And so that discussion takes place at the same time as we think about what these books are about. We're all of a certain age, and some of us talk more than others. Some are very, very quiet. But, when asked, they'll provide a perspective on what they think of the book. And I guess it's the traditional way of bringing men together is around doing something.
Yes.
Men's sheds many of us have been kind of active in the running of the synagogue and other organisations. But this isn't really about doing anything. It's just about sitting and reading and talking. And I don't think it's consciously anti-stereotypic. It's just a group. We choose our books, from a list. No, that's not right. This is the first year we've even thought about having a list. The books closely relate to who we are and what we're about. I don't think they actually talk to our life stage.
No.
They talk to kind of either an intellectual involvement in a political issue or a philosophical issue, or they're just novels that pick up on Jewish themes.
So the Jewish men's book club more or less dictates the subject matter. You wouldn't step right outside that.
No, not with this group. Well, I don't know. I mean, I've never challenged it. I've never said, let's read a non-Jewish book. And then, what's a Jewish book? Is it a book by a Jewish author, or is it a book by about a subject which is, Jewish?
So you're not about to read a crime novel?
No. Even if the author's Jewish, I don't think, because we're snobs. Don't really read that stuff. I do occasionally, and I love them, but mainly they're more on directly on themes of Judaism. They sort of stick to the theme. Of course, we kind of have talked a bit about the Holocaust, but not as much. It's really interesting because some of the people who are involved are American, and the Holocaust for Americans is different from the Holocaust for Jews in Australia. Jews who grew up directly from European backgrounds, because we are a different generation. The generation that left Europe that went to America is their grandparents or the great-grandparents, whereas ours are parents or grandparents. So yeah, no.
In a nutshell, what are you getting out of the group?
Reinforcement, people who are interested in the same kinds of things that I am, support, companionship.
Ron Hoenig talking about his Jewish men's book club, and it's always so good to hear what goes on inside book clubs. They're all so different.
Isn't it? Very hard to imagine what that one might be like, but I think I've got an idea now.
And do let us know if you've enjoyed a book and you'd like to talk about it. You can either get in touch with us at sindokukast@gmail.com or make a voice recording on your phone or whatever and send it to us at the same address.
And we would love to hear from you. It's always good to have other voices.
Cath, that's all we have for today.
It is. Thank you so much for listening, and join us again next time.
Keep reading.
This podcast is produced by 4 book addicts refusing treatment.
Sarah Martin,
Annie Hastwell.
Michaela Andreev,
And me, Cath Keneally. Our thanks to composer Quincy Grant for the music. If you want to find out more about the books and authors featured in this program, check out the show notes. And you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Sundokukast, which is TSUNDOKU cast.